Hi, and welcome to chapter, here we are. Okay, chapter 31, we're going to look at learning objective 4. And this particular objective discusses, what's wrong with inflation. So I don't think anything's wrong with inflation as long as it's predictable. So let's go ahead and jump in to this learning objective. I'm going to share my screen with you. And here. Okay. So what's the problem with inflation? And inflation is not really a problem if it's predictable and if it's managed well. So when we look at inflation, again, increase in the overall prices, and we can see some years of inflation here as depicted in this slide. The inflation rate in 2020, there was lots of variations across the country. Some countries were experiencing hyperinflation, and hyperinflation is where you have extraordinary, really high inflation. Kind of if you bought something on your way to class, and at the end of class, it could double, quadruple in prices. And many times the currency is the problem. There's too much currency or too much money in the money supply. That's why we're talking about this idea of inflation in this particular unit. So why is inflation a problem? And I've provided a link to a really good paper, 2 pages long, but it's by the International Monetary Fund. And one of the biggest problems is there's an erosion of real income is the problem. So when we talked about inflation not impacting real variables, real income would be one of those variables. So prices are rising, whereas the real earnings of individuals are not. And they're not increasing as fast as what the inflation is. And that becomes a problem. Those individuals that are on cost of living adjustments like Social Security and so on, they do get an increase in their benefits, but it tends to lag inflation. And so when we look at that, are they really better off? And although they'll think they are, the inflation fallacy, they're not. Prices do change at different rates. We're going to get into this in the next objective when we talk about some of the problems associated with inflation. Distorts our purchasing power over time in terms of we're spending more money on those things like rent, groceries, and so on. Okay, so we've already looked at the supply and demand diagram in the quantity theory of money, but now we want to kind of approach it from an equation form. And one of the ways to look at how much of an inflation is the problem is to look at velocity. Velocity is relatively constant, tends to be around 3 in our economy. And the velocity formula basically is whatever inflation is, or the CPI, times real GDP. If you're recognizing that if we take the price times real GDP, that is also equal to nominal GDP. And we divide that by the money supply. And that gives us velocity, the speed with which money changes hands. So this assume there's only one good in the economy, pizza. In 2023, the money supply is 10,000, real GDP is 3,000, the price of a pizza is 10. What is the velocity of money? So here we're going to go, okay, so velocity equals nominal GDP, price times real GDP, divided by the money supply. Our price here is going to be $10. Our real GDP is going to be 3,000. And our money supply here is going to be 10,000. So if we multiply the price times real GDP, we get 30,000. Divided that by the money supply of 10,000, and our velocity ends up being 3. So in this example, let me just kill it. the velocity, the speed with which money changes hands, or an average dollar was used in 3 transactions. Now, we can kind of rewrite the quantity theory of money equation into, the velocity equation into the quantity equation. All we're doing here is saying, on this side, we have the money supply, the speed with which money changes hands, or how many transactions is that money supply being used, level or the CPI, and we have real GDP. Now, an interesting equation to look at, what's the problem, is that if we increase the money supply, whatever we do to one side of the equation, we have to do to the other side of the equation. So if we're on an expansionary monetary policy and we increase the money supply by, say, 20%, velocity remains relatively constant over time. GDP remains relatively constant over time, around 3%. And so what do we have giving way on this side of the equation? We have the price level. And if GDP doesn't change, then the price level also increases 20%. So the direct implication of changing the money supply is that inflation is going to increase. And again, eroding real incomes, prices increasing faster in those types of items that are what we call inelastic. We can't do without food, clothing, shelter. Yeah. So let's go ahead and look at an example here. And here's our problem. The economy has enough land, labor, and capital to produce 800 bushels of corn. Velocity is relatively constant. In 2023, the money supply was 3,600 and the price of corn was $8 a bushel. And then the Fed's going to increase the money supply in the following year, 2024, by 10%. So right now we want to be thinking about, okay, so if we take the price level times real GDP has to equal velocity times the money supply. And if we're increasing the money supply by 10% on this side, then something has got to increase over here. The first part of it says, compute the 2024 values of nominal GDP and price, and then the inflation rate. So they're holding the real GDP constant. So hopefully you can see right away that the price level should increase 10%. So let's go ahead and jump on the next slide and work this one out. Okay, so portion A. Portion A, I think the easiest thing to do first is to calculate velocity. And velocity is not going to change for the two problems, hence the reason they're saying velocity is constant. Velocity is equal to nominal GDP, or the price times real GDP divided by the money supply. So from that, we have, here is GDP. Money supply is here at M, price of corn, $8. That's our price. So we're going to say velocity is equal to $8 times 1,800 real GDP divided by 3,600. And when we get that, we get a velocity of, I believe, 4. Yes, a velocity of 4. That means that the average dollar was used in 4 transactions. The next step is, what is nominal GDP and the price level after the Fed increases the money supply by 10%? Okay, so if the money supply originally was 3,600, and then the Fed is going to increase it 10%, we can just multiply it by 1.10. And that's going to give us 3960. So that's our new money supply. Now, using our equation that we just rearranged, again, kind of rearranging this equation into the quantity theory of money, we have price times real GDP is equal to velocity times the money supply. We know the money supply has changed to 39.60. We're velocity constant at 4. We know that real GDP is 1,800. And so we want to solve for P. So to clean up this equation, 1,800, we're going to have 1,800 P is equal to, and the 4 times the is 15,840. Divide each side by the 1,800. Divide each side by the 1,800. And we got the price is going to increase to $8.80. Okay, if we want to know our new nominal GDP, okay, that's going to be $8.80 times 1,800. So our new nominal GDP, I don't think I did this, but I'll do it now. 8.8 times 1,800 is going to be the, again, 15,840. Okay. Now we want to know what's the inflation rate. So the inflation rate is that change in the price level. So our original inflation rate, or P1, was $8 a bushel. After the Fed increased the money supply by 10%, we end up with $8.80. Now, if you think about this, that makes sense, because if we're increasing this by 10% over here, we're not changing GDP, then the price level has to go up by 10%. Hence the reason it's $8.80. To calculate the inflation rate here, which is going to be what? 10, right? Let's just prove it. We're going to do a percent change. So the most recent minus the previous, do that first, divided by the previous times 100 is going to give us 10%. Okay, so increasing the money supply by 10% causes an increase in the price level of 10%. Okay, let's do the second one. We don't have to calculate velocity. Suppose technological progress causes real GDP to increase to 1,950. Compute the new inflation rate. Okay, so if we know price times real GDP is equal to the money supply times, velocity. We have velocity at 4. We know the money supply increased by 10%. Just remember that's that 3,600 times 1.10, which gives us, 39.60. So 39.60 times the velocity of 4. We have the price level here. We don't know it, but we know that technological progress has increased the Y, or real GDP, to 1950. So we're just going to go ahead and solve this for the new price level. So we're going to divide 1950 by both sides. So we get 1950, just to rewrite it better. P is equal to 15,840. Again, dividing that 1950 by both sides of the equation. And we end up with the price level is going to be $8. 1, 2, 3. That's what I got. So this would be our new price level. Now, what they are asking us then to compute the inflation rate. What's the change in the price level? We started it at P1 of $8. The price level increased to $8.12 So we're going to, again, use that percent change formula. Times 100 is going to equal, and I ended up with 1.54%. So here, the price level only increased a little bit. So what changed? If we look at, again, the money supply times velocity is equal to the price level times real GDP. In the previous example, real GDP did not grow. In this example, real GDP grew. So if we're increasing this side of the equation by 10%, we would much prefer that real GDP increases some of that 10% rather than have all of it reflected in the price level. Here, if I were to ask you, how much did if we know that the price level increased 1.54, what was the percentage change in GDP? Well, if this is 10%, and we know that the price level accounts for 1.54, basically that GDP then would have grown by about 8.33%. And we'd much prefer to see that happen. Now, again, technological progress happening in an inflationary time, how is that going to happen? So again, when we talk about some of these problems of inflation, which is what we're going to do in the next chapter, I really would like you to read the PDF because I think it helps explain what are some of the effects of inflation. We don't mind low inflation because it makes households protect their dollars from inflation, which spurs spending. But when the prices are so high and wages are not keeping pace with inflation, then we see this erosion of real incomes. So I will see you in the next objective where we'll talk about, I think, some of the problems of the costs of inflation. Thanks for your time, attention. Have a great day.